My name is Madeline, and I was 31 years old when I lost the baby, and then realized I had lost the man too. I remember the hospital room more clearly than I remember most years of my life. The walls were pale, almost colorless, as if even the place itself didn't want to witness what had just happened. The doctor's voice was calm, careful, practiced, the kind of voice people use when they're delivering pain they can't fix. I stared at the ceiling while my body felt strangely empty, like something vital had been taken from me without warning or permission. Matthew wasn't holding my hand. That was the first thing that broke me. He stood near the window, arms crossed, staring outside as if the world beyond the glass could explain what we had just lost. I kept waiting for him to turn around, to come closer, to say something that would anchor me back to reality. But he didn't. And in that silence, I felt something slipping away long before I understood what it was. The baby was already gone when I arrived at the hospital. There was nothing dramatic about it. No sudden rush, no loud cries, just a quiet confirmation that life can end before it ever truly begins. I cried alone while machines beeped softly around me, marking time as if nothing important had happened. Matthew finally came closer when the nurse left. He placed his hand on my shoulder. Not my hand, not my face, my shoulder. It felt distant, polite, almost unfamiliar. "I'm sorry," he said. 2 words. That was all. I wanted him to say our baby. I wanted him to say we'll get through this. I wanted him to break down with me so I wouldn't feel so completely alone inside my own grief. But his eyes were dry, his voice steady, and something about that scared me more than the miscarriage itself. We had been together for 4 years. We talked about children casually at first, then seriously, then with excitement. When I found out I was pregnant, Matthew smiled in a way I had never seen before. Softer, almost afraid. He kissed my forehead and told me everything would change. And it did, just not the way we imagined. After the hospital, he drove us home in silence. I pressed my forehead against the window, watching familiar streets blur past, feeling like I was returning to a life that no longer fit me. When we arrived, Matthew went straight to the kitchen and poured himself a glass of water. He didn't ask if I wanted anything. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the past weeks, searching for a sign I had missed. My body ached, my heart felt hollow, and my mind kept circling the same question. Why did it feel like I was grieving alone? The days that followed were heavy and slow. Friends sent messages full of sympathy. My mother cried on the phone. Everyone treated the loss like a tragedy we shared, but something inside my home was changing. Matthew became quieter, distant. He spent more time on his phone, stepping outside to take calls he didn't explain. When I asked if he was okay, he nodded quickly, as if the answer required no thought. "I just need space," he said one evening. Space. The word echoed inside me. I needed closeness. I needed reassurance. I needed him to remind me that losing the baby hadn't broken us too. But every time I reached for him, emotionally or physically, he seemed to pull back just enough to make me doubt myself. One night, unable to sleep, I got up to get a glass of water. As I passed the hallway, I heard Matthew's voice coming from the balcony. Low, careful, intimate in a way I hadn't heard in weeks. "I can't talk right now," he whispered. "Not here." My heart started racing. I stood there, frozen, listening to the sound of his voice change. Softer, warmer, almost gentle. The way it used to sound when he spoke to me. "I told you, I need time," he said. After everything that happened, there was a pause. Then he said something that made my knees weaken. "I'll come see you tomorrow." I backed away before he could see me, my chest burning, my thoughts spiraling. I told myself not to assume anything. Grief makes people strange. Loss changes behavior. But deep down, A quiet fear had already taken shape. Because in the space where our baby used to exist, another truth was beginning to grow. And I wasn't sure I was ready to face it. The next morning, I woke up before the sun. My body felt heavy, sore in places I couldn't fully explain, like it was still searching for something that was no longer there. I lay still, listening to the quiet hum of the apartment, waiting for Matthew's breathing beside me. But the space next to me was empty. I found him in the kitchen, dressed already, tying his shoes. "You're leaving?" I asked, my voice thin and unfamiliar. He didn't look up right away. "I need to clear my head," he said. "I'll be back later." Later. Another word that felt like a door closing instead of a promise. I watched him leave without kissing me goodbye, without turning back, without noticing the way my hands trembled as I held the edge of the counter to keep myself steady. When the door shut, the silence that followed felt louder than anything I had heard in the hospital. I spent that day moving slowly through the apartment, touching things that had once felt hopeful. The corner where we had talked about setting up a crib. The drawer where I had hidden the ultrasound photo, folded so carefully it still held its shape. I pressed it against my chest and cried until my body gave up. By the time Matthew came home, it was already dark. He smelled different. Not bad. Just unfamiliar. He avoided my eyes as he set his keys down, his movements careful, almost rehearsed. "Where were you?" I asked quietly. He hesitated for half a second too long. "With a friend," he said. Something inside me tightened. "What friend?" I asked. He shrugged. "Does it matter?" It mattered, but I didn't push. I didn't have the strength to fight, not when I was still bleeding from a loss he seemed determined to move past. That night, he slept facing away from me. The distance between our bodies felt wider than the bed itself. Over the next few days, patterns began to form. Matthew stayed out late. His phone never left his side. When it buzzed, he stepped away to answer it. When I asked how he was feeling about the miscarriage, he said he didn't want to talk about it anymore. "We can't live in the past," he told me. The past. As if it hadn't just happened. As if it hadn't hollowed me out from the inside. One afternoon, while he was in the shower, his phone lit up on the nightstand. I wasn't trying to snoop. I swear that's true. But the screen was facing up and the name was impossible to ignore. Lena. The message preview was short. "I miss you." My heart started pounding so hard I thought it might wake him. I stared at the phone, frozen, my mind racing through explanations that didn't quite fit. A coworker, a friend, someone comforting him. But the tone of the message didn't sound like comfort. It sounded like longing. I put the phone back exactly where it was, my hands shaking, my chest tight. When Matthew came out of the bathroom, wrapped in a towel, I pretended to be asleep. That night, I didn't sleep at all. The next day, I did something I had never done before. I followed him. He left the apartment mid-afternoon, telling me he had errands to run. I waited 10 minutes, then grabbed my coat and keys, my heart racing with every step. I stayed far enough behind to feel invisible, close enough to see where he went. He didn't go to the grocery store. He didn't go to work. He parked outside a small cafe across town, the kind of place couples go when they don't want to be recognized. I watched from my car as he walked inside, my breath shallow, my hands gripping the steering wheel. 5 minutes later, she arrived. Lena was younger than me. Beautiful in a quiet, effortless way. She wore a soft sweater and had her hair pulled back loosely, like she hadn't tried too hard, like she didn't need to. Matthew stood when he saw her. He smiled. Not the polite smile he gave strangers. The real one. The one he used to give me. I watched them talk through the window, their heads leaning closer together, their laughter easy, unguarded. At one point, she reached across the table and touched his hand. He didn't pull away. That was the moment I understood. It wasn't just grief pulling him away from me. it was choice. I sat there long after they left, the cafe lights blurring through tears I hadn't realized were falling. By the time I drove home, something inside me had shifted from confusion to clarity. That evening, Matthew came home later than usual. I didn't ask where he had been. I didn't need to. I looked at him and realized that while I had been losing a child, he had been building another life, one that didn't include me. And I knew deep down that the hardest part wasn't the miscarriage anymore. It was the fact that I was still here, waiting for a man who had already chosen someone else. I didn't confront him right away. Not because I was afraid of the truth, but because part of me still hoped I was wrong. Hope is cruel like that. It whispers possibilities even when reality is standing right in front of you, undeniable and sharp. The next morning, Matthew kissed my cheek before leaving for work. The gesture was soft, almost tender, and for a second it confused me. His lips lingered just long enough to remind me of what we used to be. When the door closed behind him, I stood there frozen, wondering how someone could leave so gently while carrying such a heavy secret. I spent that day replaying the scene at the cafe over and over in my mind. The way he smiled, the way he leaned forward, the way she touched his hand as if it belonged there. Each memory pressed against my chest until breathing felt like work. By the time he came home, I had made up my mind. "Who is Lena?" I asked, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. Matthew stopped mid-step. For a moment, his face went blank, like a mask slipping before being put back on. "She's just someone from work," he said quickly. I nodded slowly. "Do people from work usually tell you they miss you?" I asked. Silence stretched between us, thick and uncomfortable. He set his bag down carefully, avoiding my eyes. "I didn't want to hurt you," he said. That was when I knew. Not because he admitted anything directly, but because innocent people don't lead with apologies. "How long?" I asked. Matthew exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "It started a few months ago," he said, "before the pregnancy." The words landed like a second loss, almost heavier than the first. "So while I was planning a future," I said quietly, "you were already halfway out the door." "It wasn't like that," he replied quickly. "I never planned for you to get pregnant. Things were complicated." Complicated. Another word people use when they don't want to say selfish. "And after I lost the baby?" I asked. "After that?" He looked at me then, really looked at me, and something in his eyes hardened. "I couldn't stay," he said. "Everything felt too heavy. I needed something that didn't remind me of what we lost." I stared at him, my heart pounding. "So you chose her," I said. Matthew didn't answer. He didn't have to. The choice was already written in the space between us, in the distance he had built brick by brick while I was bleeding in silence. "I'm not asking you to leave," he said finally. I need time. Time. Always time. Time was what he had been giving her while taking it away from me. I nodded slowly. "Go," I said. He frowned. "Go?" "Go to her," I clarified, "if that's where you already are." Matthew hesitated, as if expecting me to beg, to cry, to collapse. I didn't. "I'll pack a bag," he said after a moment. I watched him walk into the bedroom, open drawers, fold clothes with practiced efficiency. It was astonishing how quickly a life could be reduced to a suitcase. When he came back into the living room, bag in hand, he paused. "I never meant to hurt you," he said again. I met his eyes. "But you did," I replied. "And you don't get to undo that just because you didn't mean it." He left without another word. I sank onto the couch only after the door closed, my body finally giving in to the weight it had been carrying. I cried then, not loud, not dramatic, but deep and quiet, like something breaking slowly instead of all at once. The days that followed were empty and endless. I moved through them like a ghost, answering messages I didn't want to receive, avoiding places that reminded me of him. The miscarriage had taken my child, and now the truth had taken my partner. The loss felt layered, impossible to separate. One afternoon, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "I'm so sorry," it read. "I didn't know about the baby." My hands shook. I didn't need to ask who it was. Lena. I stared at the screen, 1,000 responses forming in my mind. Anger, accusation, pain. Instead, I typed back the only thing that felt true. "Neither did you. Now you do." That night, lying alone in bed, I placed my hand on my stomach out of habit, then remembered there was nothing there anymore. The absence hurt in a way that felt physical, like my body was mourning something my heart already knew was gone. And in that quiet, I realized something terrifying. The baby was gone. Matthew was gone. But the pain was just beginning. The apartment felt too large after Matthew left. Every sound echoed, the refrigerator humming, the clock ticking, the distant traffic outside. At night, the silence pressed against my chest so hard I sometimes slept with the television on, just to remind myself that the world was still moving, even if mine had stopped. I took time off work, telling my boss I needed to recover physically. That wasn't a lie. It just wasn't the whole truth. What I really needed was time to understand who I was without the life I thought I was building. Friends came by with food I barely touched. They spoke softly, carefully, as if grief were something that might break if handled too roughly. Everyone talked about the miscarriage. No one talked about Matthew. I didn't either. Saying his name out loud felt like reopening a wound that refused to close. Weeks passed. My body healed faster than my heart. One afternoon, while cleaning out the closet, I found the small box where I had kept the baby's first things: a tiny pair of socks, a folded note I had written to myself the day I found out I was pregnant. I sat on the floor holding those pieces of a future that would never exist, crying until my throat burned. That was the day I decided to leave. Not because I was running away, but because staying felt like drowning slowly. I packed what I could fit into my car and drove to my sister's house 3 hours away. She didn't ask questions when she opened the door. She just hugged me tightly, and for the first time in weeks, I felt held. Life there was quieter, simpler. I started going for walks in the morning, letting the air fill my lungs. I cooked meals again. I slept through the night without waking up in a panic. Healing didn't come all at once, but it came in pieces small enough to carry. Matthew called once. I didn't answer. He left a voicemail, his voice hesitant, apologetic, uncertain. "I hope you're okay," he said. "I think about you sometimes." Sometimes. I deleted the message without replying. Months later, I heard through mutual friends that he had moved in with Lena. They sounded happy, people said, as if happiness were something you could measure from the outside. The news hurt, but not in the way I expected. It felt distant, like hearing about a storm in a city you no longer lived in. One evening, my sister found me sitting on the porch, watching the sun disappear behind the trees. "You don't talk about him much," she said gently. "I don't need to anymore," I replied. And I realized it was true. What I missed wasn't Matthew. It was the version of myself who believed love would never abandon her when she needed it most. I began therapy shortly after that. Talking helped. Naming the pain gave it shape, made it something I could look at instead of something that lived inside me without permission. I learned that grief isn't just about loss. It's about betrayal. About the sudden understanding that the future you trusted was never guaranteed. One night, long after everyone else was asleep, I wrote a letter. Not to Matthew, to the baby. I told them how loved they had been, even in their short existence, how their presence had changed me, how losing them had broken me, and how I was slowly learning to stand again. I burned the letter the next morning, watching the smoke rise into the sky, carrying words that didn't need an answer. By the time a year had passed, I had moved into my own small apartment. I found a new job, new routines, new ways to exist in the world without constantly bracing for pain. I thought the story was over. I was wrong. Because healing doesn't mean the past disappears. It just means you're strong enough to face it when it comes back. And it came back one evening, in the form of a message I never expected to receive. It was from Matthew. "I need to talk to you," it read. "Please." My heart didn't race this time. It just sank. Because some conversations don't reopen wounds. They reveal scars you didn't know were still there. I stared at Matthew's message for a long time before I answered. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I knew that whatever I said would open a door I had worked very hard to close. In the end, I typed a single word. Why? The reply came almost immediately. "I owe you the truth." That sentence alone was enough to make my chest tighten. We agreed to meet in a quiet park near my apartment, the kind of place where people go to walk their dogs or sit alone with their thoughts. Neutral ground. No shared memories. No walls that had once held our laughter. When I arrived, Matthew was already there, sitting on a bench, hands clasped tightly in front of him. He looked thinner, older, not broken but worn, like someone who had made choices and was now living inside them. He stood when he saw me. "Madeline," he said softly. Hearing my name in his voice felt strange, like hearing a song you used to love after years of silence. "Matthew?" I replied. We sat. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The wind moved through the trees above us, leaves falling slowly, carelessly, as if loss were just another part of the season. "I left Lena," he said finally. I nodded once. "I know," I said. "I heard." He looked surprised. "She told people," I continued. "People talk." Matthew exhaled, staring at the ground. "It wasn't what I thought it would be," he said. "Being with her. After everything." I waited. "She never asked me to stay," he went on. "I chose to. And when things got hard, I realized I had left the only person who would have stayed when I was at my worst. I felt something stir inside me. Not hope, understanding. "You didn't choose her because you loved her more," I said calmly. "You chose her because she didn't remind you of your failure." Matthew's eyes filled. "You lost the baby," he whispered, and I couldn't face what that meant about me. I closed my eyes for a second. "I lost the baby," I said, "but I also lost you, and you made that choice alone." He nodded, tears slipping down his face. "I know," he said, "and I'll regret it for the rest of my life." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I found this when I was packing," he said. "I think it's yours." It was a copy of the ultrasound photo, the one I thought I had lost. My hands shook as I took it. "I kept it," he said quickly. "Not because I deserved to, but because I couldn't let it go." I looked at the image, the shape that had once been our future, and felt grief rise again. Softer this time, less violent, but just as real. "I didn't come here to ask you to come back," Matthew said. "I know I don't have that right." I looked up at him. "Then why are you here?" I asked. He swallowed. "Because I need you to know that choosing her was the worst mistake of my life," he said. "And losing the baby didn't destroy us." I did. His honesty landed heavy between us. For a moment, I imagined a different ending. One where he had stayed. One where we had mourned together. One where the baby's loss had bound us instead of breaking us. But imagination is not the same as truth. "I forgive you," I said quietly. Matthew looked at me, stunned. "But I don't want you back," I added. That was the moment something shifted in his face. Not pain, relief, because forgiveness, I realized, was never for him. It was for me. I needed to say goodbye properly, I continued. Not as the woman you left, but as the woman who survived. Matthew nodded slowly. I'm glad you did, he said. We sat there a while longer, not talking, just letting the past rest where it belonged. When I stood to leave, he didn't stop me. And for the first time since the miscarriage, I felt something close to peace. Because closure doesn't come from hearing the right words. It comes from knowing you no longer need them. I walked home alone after that meeting, my steps slow, deliberate, as if I were relearning how to move through the world without carrying someone else's weight on my back. The air felt lighter than I expected. Not joyful, just honest. Like the quiet that comes after a storm finally passes. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in a long while. No dreams, no memories pulling me backward. Just rest. In the weeks that followed, something inside me began to soften. I stopped replaying conversations that no longer mattered. I stopped imagining alternate versions of my life where the baby survived and Matthew stayed. Those versions had belonged to a woman who didn't exist anymore. I was someone else now. Stronger, quieter, more careful with my heart. I planted flowers on the small balcony of my apartment, something I had never done before. I liked watching them grow slowly, patiently, without asking anything from me except time. It reminded me that not everything that begins is meant to last. But that doesn't make it meaningless. On the anniversary of the miscarriage, I took the day off work and went to the ocean. I sat on the sand, letting the wind tangle my hair, listening to the waves move in and out like breathing. I spoke out loud, not to Matthew, not to the past, but to the child I never got to hold. I told them they were real, that they mattered, that they were loved. And then I let them go. Months later, someone new entered my life. Not dramatically, not all at once. Just a man who listened, who stayed present, who didn't disappear when things became uncomfortable. There was no rush, no promises whispered too soon. Just steadiness. And that was enough. Sometimes people ask me if I ever think about Matthew. I do. But not with anger, not with longing. I think of him as a chapter that taught me something painful and necessary. That love is not proven by words or timing, but by who stays when everything falls apart. Losing the baby broke my heart. Losing Matthew broke my illusion. And in the quiet space left behind, I found myself. I learned that grief doesn't mean weakness. That walking away can be an act of self-respect. And that choosing yourself after everything else is gone is not selfish. It's survival. This isn't a story about being chosen. It's a story about choosing to live after loss. And that choice changed everything.